Namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is weekly English talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. This weekly talk show features the guests from different walk of life, and sometimes this talk show actually conducts face-to-face interviews, sometimes online interviews of guests from especially from different countries, and we try to connect the experiences, the lesson learned with the indigenous communities around the globe. And I invite guests to discuss on contemporary issues that indigenous communities are facing in this talk show. So today also I have a very special guest. Let me introduce him today. His name is Dr. Jonathan Lilleblad, and he is now involved with the School of Law under the Australian National University. But he is more with research and academic sector, and his research is basically focused on human rights, indigenous people's rights, and environmental issues, and so forth. So when I read about his background, that was really fascinating in the sense that he comes from Pa'o indigenous community from Myanmar. He was born in Myanmar, but he grew up in Sweden and also in US. Yeah. Now working mostly focusing with Southeast Asia with the indigenous peoples. So I have invited him. Let me first welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you. Namaste.
So as I said in background that you connecting with your right from your birth to the academic all the background. Jonathan, could you introduce yourself, the areas that I haven't focused but you want to emphasize into?
Yes, happy to do so. And thanks for having me here today, and greetings to everyone in the audience as well. Just a brief summary about my background to give some additional details. So I was born in an area of Myanmar called Shan State, specifically a town called Taungji, which is the eastern part of what's called Myanmar, previously Burma. And the Pa'o indigenous peoples, they're a very small community in that part of the country. My family left Burma when I was 6 months old, and we were spending time in Thailand, but then we were in Sweden until the time I was 7, and then after the age of 7 I was living in the United States. I arrived in Australia in 2013, and that's where I've been living and working the entire time. Most of my research, you mentioned the human rights, indigenous rights, and environment. I focus primarily on those issues within the context of developing countries. I'm very interested in the efforts to promote international norms or international law in developing countries on these issues and the kinds of difficulties and challenges that arise. Most of my work has been supported by aid organizations like Asia Development Bank, International Commission of Jurists, Danish Institute of Human Rights, and then also a German organization called Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And these allow me to spend time away from the university doing field research, where I collect data and I meet other actors in different countries. The countries I've been active in, primarily Myanmar, that was most of my time. There's also Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, Malaysia, a little bit in Bhutan, and then just now starting with Nepal.
Thank you, Jonathan, for in-depth describing about yourself and your work. I will come back to discuss about how this aid organizations really helping to the indigenous community in the ground later on. But I want to start with our conversations. Let me just ask you a question that as you were born in Myanmar, as you said that you traveled to, a little bit, you spent time in Thailand and then went to Sweden, and then you got your higher studies in US, and then returned back to Australia again to work with this Asia or Asia Pacific or Southeast Asia. How this, your upbringing, especially from Asia and also, into different part of the world, actually helped you to connect with the, global environmental law, with the struggles of indigenous peoples in Asia especially?
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's part of my background that I think is people have told me is rather unique. As you note, I was educated in the West, predominantly educated in the United States. That's where I had in the American system, it's a PhD, international relations, and then a JD, or a Juris Doctor in law. But then for my bachelor's degree, I was studying engineering. So people have described my background as being very cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan in terms of the educational subjects that I studied, the degrees that I earned, but then also the cultures that I lived in. And I think that's been my biggest strength, is that I'm able to understand different perspectives, and I'm able to look at and investigate and perceive different ideas and concepts. So the word you hear is empathy, empathize. So I have the ability to understand someone else's perspective on an issue. And this has been very critical for my work, because quite often I am trying to connect disagreements between Westerners versus, say, local communities in the areas that I visit in Asia.
Okay. So when I happened to read your, biography, as well as the work of, the areas of your work, especially your research work, I saw a lot of writings you actually wrote about the struggles that indigenous peoples are facing, focusing with Asia. So being an academics or researcher, and your experience traveling into different countries, if you have to pin down what are some of the biggest challenges that the indigenous peoples, especially from South Asia or Southeast Asia in particular, or indigenous peoples in the global, you can connect with, what are some of the challenges that they are facing?
Yeah, and that's a very timely question with a lot of urgent issues. My perspective is that, as a scholar of international law and international relations, there has been a substantial amount of work done within the international system to try and support indigenous peoples. So hence we have the growth of indigenous rights movements in the global level over decades. And the products of this, are the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the International Labor Organization Convention number 169, but then there's also been concurrent work now within the international human rights system and the international environmental law system. The issue, the problem that I encounter is that much of the work that has been accomplished at the international level is not being implemented at the local level. We have nation states, particularly in Southeast Asia, where in the countries I visited, where we have political leaders that are reluctant to recognize indigenous peoples. They're extremely resistant to adopting international norms or international law. And as a result, it's been very difficult to implement or make progress at the local level for indigenous communities. And in Southeast Asia, this is a major problem, because almost every country I have visited, the political leaders and the larger society, they've been extremely reluctant to acknowledge the existence of indigenous peoples and the idea of self-determination. They see it as a threat to the existence of the nation state. And as a result, it's been extremely difficult to advance the idea of international norms or international law for indigenous rights within domestic situations. And I think this is the biggest challenge I've seen in Asia.
I want to just come back again, the wording that you actually put, that you were more associated earlier, you involved more with the aid organizations, like, and especially in Nepal or in South Asia, that the countries that I have traveled, these aid organizations, especially like Asian Development Bank, including World Bank, or other major organizations, corporates actually, the funding that they have funded the projects, such as mining, hydropower, and so forth, but they have been claiming as benefiting to the community, that development actually they brought to the communities. But the way I see that indigenous peoples are protesting against these projects, as a researcher or being involved with this, aid organization, to what extent do you think that these kinds of, projects funded by these corporations benefiting to the indigenous peoples in the ground?
That's a very good question, and my research and my experience has been that it's an incredibly problematic system. It's not necessarily with individual aid organizations. I think the word I describe, it's structural. It's a structural problem of international aid as a whole, as an entire system. International aid is an industry where there are donors. They supply the money. And then there are implementers. So these are the organizations that receive the money and launch capacity building programs, technical assistance programs, resource infrastructure programs. And then there are the recipient organizations within nation states. And at the very end, you have the indigenous communities that are affected by all of these activities. The structural problem that I see, and this is what I mean by the word structure, is that the people who have the money, they control the money. So a lot of the donors, they set conditions on their funding. Those conditions then apply to the implementing organizations. The implementing organizations are giving much more attention to the donors than they are to the aid recipients. And then even within the nation state, we have a situation of local politics and local political leaders that are then manipulating the international aid for their own agendas, and it very rarely assists the indigenous communities at the very end. So I see that there are quite often good intentions. I think if you talk to people in, for example, Europe, North America, even in places like Oceania, where there's Australia and New Zealand, they tend to have very good intentions. They want to help, but they don't understand what's happening in developing countries, and they don't understand what's happening with the money, and they are not very responsive to the challenges that are happening at the local level and what we see here within indigenous communities.
Thank you, Jonathan, for bringing this really better reality into the discussion again. But as you said that earlier, that you studied the international law and more focused with the international environmental law as well. So earlier also in your discussion, as you said, that there has been effort made by international communities developing different legal frameworks. And to what extent do you think that these existing, earlier you said about the shortcomings of this international legal framework as well, but to what extent do you think the international law, especially international environmental law, better protect the indigenous peoples, their rights, especially when you talk about relating with the climate change or biodiversities? Indigenous peoples especially are at the forefront, but there is also environmental discussion which is taking place in the international spheres as well. So being international law scholars, how do you see the indigenous peoples in the ground and international legal framework on the other hand?
Yeah, so there it's when you describe the positive things, to me it's actually very complicated. So it's not a simple answer. There's potential for it to be positive, and when I say there's potential, one of the benefits of having a global discourse, a global discussion, a global system, is that it sets standards that everyone can recognize, right? That the entire world will understand. There are certain standards that we expect in terms of protecting the environment. There are certain standards that we expect in terms of how people treat each other. There are certain standards we expect in terms of what we want to see from international relations, from investment, from having assistance to developing countries, all of these things. This is the potential benefit of having global efforts. The other benefit of a global effort is that it mobilizes resources. You're able to connect the assets, the resources, countries that have expertise in environmental issues, that have expertise on human rights issues, and then they're able to connect them with people who desperately need that kind of expertise and that kind of assistance. So that's potential. The issue is that indigenous peoples are being excluded quite often from these discussions. Indigenous peoples are not being allowed to participate and give feedback. So what happens in the international system, and this is the reality, so this difference between potential versus reality, the reality is that we have a lot of good intentions from the global community, but they don't treat indigenous peoples as human beings. They treat them as objects. They don't listen to indigenous peoples. They don't listen to indigenous concerns. And this is the entire challenge of not just participation, but meaningful participation by indigenous peoples, where indigenous peoples are present in global decision making. Indigenous peoples are able to give their perspectives in global decision making, and then most critically, that the global decisions reflect the wishes and the interests of indigenous voices. So I think this is one of the complexities that is still not fully resolved, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. But then, though there is bad intention behind all this, the international laws, especially relating with the indigenous peoples, if you just look into the paragraphs or provisions of each international laws, you name like ILO Convention number 169 or UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that actually guarantees a host of rights of indigenous peoples. As you said about the the good faith, or the right to free, prior, and informed consent, or right to self-determination, and so forth, or indigenous peoples' right to land, territory, resources, and so forth. There is international law. There is a right, the guaranteed in one part, but on the other hand, the indigenous peoples are still struggling on the same rights, right, to enjoy that same rights. In that regard, I also have seen a lot of case studies that you have documented. So some of the successful case studies also you have documented in that. Could you just share some of the example or case studies that indigenous peoples struggle winning a kind of rights, especially in this guaranteed under the international law?
Yeah, so this is also a good question. That the international system has a structure that it creates a hierarchy. It creates this vertical system where the Westerners are at the top and indigenous peoples are at the bottom, right? But what's impressive, and what I've seen in many cases, that there are indigenous peoples, they exercise what's called agency. They have their own independence, they have their own autonomy, they're able to exercise their own actions and choose their own actions, and they actually work against the structure, they work against the system, and then most impressively, they manipulate the international system to protect themselves. And even here in Nepal, I'm seeing this, and what I mean by this is that I've seen cases in Mexico, in the United States, in Australia, even here in Nepal, and the cases I've encountered in Myanmar and Cambodia, where there are indigenous communities. They know that indigenous knowledge is not the same as legal knowledge, that indigenous approaches are not the same as international legal approaches. But what they've done is that they've made an effort to learn. So you have indigenous communities, they have representatives who received an education, who are able to understand international law, able to understand Western law, but then most critically, they're able to use it. They're able to manipulate it for their own interests. And so what we've seen within the past few decades is that there are an increasing number of indigenous groups that are appearing in international venues like the United Nations, the international venues of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Human Rights Council, that we have indigenous actors that are appearing in these spaces. And so even though it's very different from indigenous knowledge or very different from indigenous approaches, these indigenous actors are able to translate their own perspectives into the language of the United Nations, into the language of these international legal spaces, in a way that then protects and advances indigenous rights. And so what we see, and what I think we want to encourage as much as possible, is that indigenous voices are representing indigenous interests within international law. And this was one of the failings in the past, is that, and there's this phrase that I think most of the audience should learn. The problem with international law or Western assistance to Western assistance to indigenous peoples, or the global North assistance to the indigenous peoples, it fails to understand the problem of paternalism. And there's a simple phrase: we don't want you to make decisions about us without us, right? In other words, that paternalism is where you have someone who's in London, Washington, D.C., Geneva, who is making decisions about you in Nepal. True. Without listening to you. That's not a real relationship. That's a paternalistic relationship. It's like a father talking to a baby. And that's not how people should treat each other. And under human rights law, that's not an appropriate way to have a relationship. So with a lot of what's going on right now with indigenous agency and indigenous involvement in international law, they're trying to adjust that relationship. And they're trying to say, okay, we don't want you to make decisions about us without us. We want you to make decisions about us with us. We want to be in the room We want to be in the discussions that make decisions, and we want to have an influence on the decision making that happens in these international venues.
So, in your opinion or your experiences, or based on your study, what do you think are the responsible for not letting indigenous peoples be, participating in this decision-making level? Is it the indigenous peoples themselves who are not, capable enough to speak about their rights, or do you think this is because of the corrupt? Let me use this word as corrupt. Perhaps it may give a negative connotation as well, but the system, right? Do you think that is alienating or excluding the indigenous peoples to represent in that bodies, or what is your suggestion actually to improve the situations?
Right. So this is where we talk about the politics of law. There's law, but there's politics of law. So what I mean by this is that there are different interests, different actors trying to use their influence to change the law. They're trying to use their power to make use of the law. Indigenous peoples are doing what they should do. They're like any other actor. They're trying to exercise and express their own power to use the law. But this is a big world, and I think what you're alluding to is an example of the fact that there are many interests in this world, many different actors. All of them have their own ambitions. All of them want to make use of the law to benefit themselves. And so it's not a situation where we say the law is inherently good or law is inherently bad. The law is an instrument, it's a tool, and it depends on who is using it. So just like indigenous peoples are trying to use international law for indigenous interests, we see other actors, corporations, multinational corporations, certain states, nation states, certain NGOs, international organizations that are trying to manipulate the international system to advance their own benefits. So it's a competition is what's happening. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that's playing out right now. Sadly, it runs contrary to the ideals of much of international law. So international environmental law, international human rights in particular. It wants to promote all human beings. It wants to promote the environment. But it's a situation where the politics of it's open to competition between different actors trying to advance their own interests. And I think this is the reality that everyone, not just indigenous peoples, but everyone needs to understand.
Thanks, Jonathan. So earlier you actually talked about the global indigenous peoples movement, right? So staying outside, let's say, if I just tell you in Nepal, indigenous peoples are united. So united, that means they have an organization, united organization. We have particular indigenous peoples organizations. They are united under the federations. They have a regional organization and so forth. But when you talk about the global indigenous peoples movement, looking from outside to inside, how do you see the Asian indigenous peoples movement, especially in terms of, growing or in terms of flourishing, or how do you actually see the Asian indigenous peoples movement, and how can we forecast maybe after 10 years or 20 years, how do we see Asian indigenous peoples movement actually reaching that space?
Yes, and this is where I think your audience should take time to learn a little bit of history about the global indigenous movement. The indigenous rights, the concept of indigenous rights is relatively recent in Asia. I think that there was a lot of participation by different groups in the development of International Labour Organization Convention number 169, and then also with the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But in terms of actual organized rights, indigenous rights organizations, there has been a much stronger history, particularly in terms of political organizations in places like the United States, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And there was a lot of leadership coming out of these. And when I say leadership, I don't just mean in terms of political activism, but in terms of developing theory, ideas, concepts of indigeneity, the meaning of indigenous, the meaning of what it means to be indigenous, the meaning of indigenous rights. And there was quite a bit of discussion that occurred, particularly going from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s on this. In Asia, in contrast, just because there was so much violence in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia and South Asia, the idea of indigenous rights, the idea of indigeneity took longer to develop. And so we were having discussions a few days ago about this. Like in Myanmar, the indigenous rights movement really only started to develop after 2013. In other countries, my understanding was that it was in Indonesia. It was in the 1990s that it really started to develop. In Nepal, I think it's more recent. What this means is that, as an outsider, what I see is that there's growing participation from Asia in terms of global indigenous movement, but it's still in the process of maturing. It's learning about the existing discussions that have happened regarding the meaning of indigeneity, the meaning of what it means to be indigenous peoples, the idea of indigenous rights. And so I think members of your audience, if they want to feel part of the global movement of indigenous peoples, they have to be aware of the diversity of perspectives. And to do that, they should make an effort to spend a little time looking at the predecessors that have occurred in like the United States and Canada, and then also in Australia and New Zealand.
So, Jonathan, I have so many issues to talk to, but because of time limitations,
Understood.
I cannot talk. But then now, at last, I would like to give you a couple of minutes to talk. We have covered so many issues about indigenous peoples movement, international laws, protections, and indigenous peoples struggle in the ground. But I don't want to ask you any more questions, but I would like to give you an opportunity to share anything that, at last you want to share, or give a kind of message to the viewers. Maybe a couple of lines that at last, please.
Yes. I think the main message is, and this is for me adopting a much bigger perspective in terms of scale, in terms of like the globe, but then also scale in terms of time. I think, you notice I use the word movement, all right? So I'm not always using the language of law. Quite often I use the language of politics. And the reason I do that is that I want people to understand that when we advocate for indigenous rights and when we engage on environmental or human rights issues or political issues as indigenous peoples, that this is actually a process. It's something that's going to take a lot of time. It's something that's going to involve a lot of outreach to partners outside of our communities. As a result, that when we try to advance our own perspectives as an indigenous community, if you wanted to, your community wanted to advance its own interests, because of the structure of the international system, you'll need to have a coalition. You need friends. You need partners, but then also you need to have a strategy that covers time. And so, progress does not happen in 1 month. It does not happen in 1 season. It does not happen in 1 year. The change that we've seen on a global level has been decades in the making. So multi-generational, and it's so that what that means for us as indigenous peoples, we have to find ways to work together, to build alliances, but then also find ways to build a long-term strategy, and then be able to carry that strategy forward.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your insight, and thank you so much for joining us at Indigenous Television.
All right, thank you.
So we have come almost at the end of the show. Today, actually, I invited Jonathan. He's really expert in international law, especially following the indigenous people's rights. So we discussed on so many issues. As I said, we have come at the end of the show, but our conversation doesn't end here. If you have any questions or queries in regards to the program, you can reach us at indigenoustelevision@gmail.com. By then, next week, I will come up with a new guest to discuss on new issues. By then, have a nice weekend. Namaste.